The global population has surpassed 8 billion. It took 200,000 years for our ancestors to reach 1 billion. We added the same billion in just 11 years. But what is next? If everything continues in the same way, will we all fit here? Will there be enough food and even toilet paper? We need to figure this out, and you'll learn everything about overpopulation. The planet is not elastic. How many people can the planet accommodate? And will we reach some critical point? What determines the number of children in a family? And what does women's rights have to do with it? In reality, of course, no one knows the exact number of people on Earth. For example, in developing countries, there is no accurate count, especially in Africa. Not everywhere are censuses conducted regularly, so physically counting all people is simply unrealistic. But today, demographers build quite accurate models. Some counters say that there are already 8 billion of us. But the most authoritative says that the birthday of the 8 billionth resident of the Earth was in November 15th, 2022. One of the possible images of the future. The growth of the human population leads to even greater overuse of resources and the worst scenario of climate change. Familiar ecosystems are dying, military conflicts over resources are occurring around the world, pandemics are constantly erupting, there is a shortage of food and energy, so their consumption is strictly limited. These are fantasies, but the problems are already real. For example, 1 in 3 people on Earth does not have access to clean water. How did it happen that there are so many of us? So, a quick history of humanity in numbers. Year 0, 190 million people. Year 1000, about 250 million. Year 1800, the planet's population is 1 billion. Then the Industrial Revolution happens. We can finally feed and clothe everyone. Medicine also develops, and by 1940, 2.3 billion. By 1970, already 3.7 billion. Now 8. In 70 years, by 2092, it will grow by another 2.5 billion compared to today. We have known for a long time that we are becoming too many too quickly. Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich wrote his books in 1968, The Demographic Bomb. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will die of starvation due to overpopulation. However, when the book was published, this sentence was later edited. They started printing it in the 1980s. So why are we still alive? Or at least pretending to be a successfully functioning civilization? In general, we have already faced an ecological and humanitarian crisis. It is important that from a demographic point of view, each country is fighting its own problem. And that's why, in fact, the growth in birth rates and the demographic boom are part of the 4-stage process called the demographic transition. Developed countries have already undergone this transition, while other countries are experiencing these changes right now. In the 1700s, the whole world was at the first stage of transition. At that time, life in Europe was worse than in modern developing countries. There was terrible medicine. Colds were treated with bloodletting. We glossed over problems with justice. Witches were burned at the stake. Additionally, there was poverty, constant unsanitary conditions, and epidemics. Back then, birth rates were significantly higher, but so was mortality. For example, in the 1700s, a woman would have 4 to 6 children, sometimes more, but only 2 would survive to adulthood. When the Industrial Revolution began in mid-18th century Britain, economic development led to the creation of the middle class and improved living standards and medical care for the poor. The power of trade unions. Mortality decreased, leading to a demographic explosion, doubling Britain's population from 1750 to 1850. This began the second transitional stage. In many other countries this happened later, but the essence was the same. When child mortality decreased, the third transitional stage began. At this stage, people noticed that most of their children survived and stopped having them in large numbers. Consequently, population growth slowed down. Ultimately, a balance is established with fewer deaths and births. Society takes on a stable population growth rate and reaches the last 4th stage of demographic transition. This happens in all countries. Most countries have reached the 4th stage of transition, and now the average number of children per family on the planet is approximately 2.5. In 80 years, developing countries will see a decrease in birth rates from more than 6 children to less than 3. Malaysia and South Africa reached this point in 34 years, Bangladesh in 20 and Iran in 10. This happened much faster than in the pioneering countries. If developing countries receive support, they will reach this even faster. Every time the discussion starts about measures to reduce birth rates, an ethical question arises. Do we even have the right to influence the number of children within a family? By the way, there's a popular social movement, child-free. People are refusing to have children for environmental reasons. Who are we to determine the number of children in a family? Especially since artificial attempts to influence family planning have sometimes led to terrible consequences. For example, state control in China. People were allowed to have only one child, and many preferred to have a boy. If a girl was expected, they opted for abortion. This resulted in a gender imbalance. Today in China, there are 30 million more men than women. When looking at specific age groups, there is a significant imbalance and the population is aging. Another example is when the state imposes partial or full bans on abortions in an attempt to increase the population. This trend exists in many countries today. Although the scientific community has repeatedly spoken about the harm of such bans, at least because women in critical circumstances will still have abortions, but in life-threatening conditions. Additionally, in 2001, economists published an article demonstrating the link between abortion bans and teenage crime rates 18 years later. In general, whether a person has children and how many should not be decided by the government. The most effective way to accelerate demographic transition, according to the scientific community, is to fight for women's rights, provide women's education, and ensure universal access to contraception. This changes people's lives and society faster. The connection between women's education and childbirth, especially in countries where women have limited access to education, is clear. For example, in Ghana, women with secondary education have an average of 2 to 3 children, while uneducated women have about 6. Education leads to later marriage, later childbirth, fewer children, more resources per child, and better health and survival rates for mothers and children. If the problem of the second and third stages of demographic transition are overpopulation, lack of access to healthcare, education, and shortages of food and water, then the problem in the fourth stage is population decline. Population aging weakens the economy. Young people pay taxes to support a larger number of retirees, and this imbalance leads to a crisis. Solutions vary, from extending working age to retirement to welcoming immigration policies. According to UN forecasts, Earth's population will not grow as sharply and will increase by 2.5 billion by 2092, reaching 10.5 billion. How much more can the planet accommodate? There are different estimates. UN scientists and those from the University of Washington believe that 11 billion is the number we will reach by the beginning of the next century, and that's our maximum. Max Singer, co-founder of the Hudson Institute and author of The History of the Future, thinks there's a scenario where Earth can sustain 250 billion people, living well by efficiently using the infinite energy of the sun. This scenario contradicts current demographic views, but emphasizes an important idea. Overpopulation is not the main issue. The real problem is our excessive resource consumption. In 1970, with 3.5 billion people, Earth's overshoot day was first recorded on December 29th, meaning by this date, humanity had used more resources than the planet can replenish in a year. By 2022, this day had moved to July 28th. Technologies for economical and efficient resource use exist and are developing. The example is Singapore, which lacks natural freshwater sources but has created a system to desalinate ocean water and recycle wastewater into clean drinking water. We could have a much larger population depending on how wisely we use resources. We continue living as if resources were still plentiful for everyone, but with our increased numbers, we need to adapt. Now, with 8 billion of us, if you're concerned about overpopulation and its environmental impact, you can personally help. Firstly, being educated and helping others become educated is useful. Consider donating to education in your country and in developing countries. Think about adopting a child, promote access to contraception and scientific knowledge of human sexuality, and of course, use resources wisely. This way, you're not only physically reducing consumption, but also contributing to a culture of sensible consumption.